Moscow, March 5, 1953. Joseph Stalin is dead. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades, who had industrialized a country through forced labor and famine, who had defeated Nazi Germany at a cost of tens of millions of lives, who had constructed the most comprehensive totalitarian system in European history, who had made himself into something approaching a living god within the ideological framework of the Soviet state, is dead at the age of 74 in his dacha at Kuntsevo, outside Moscow, of a cerebral hemorrhage that had left him incapacitated on the floor of his dining room for hours before his security personnel found the courage to enter the room and confirm what they had suspected and feared. The men who gather around his body and around the political vacuum his death has created are the people who have survived proximity to him, who have learned the specific skills of navigation within a system where the wrong word, the wrong association, the wrong response to a shifting political current could mean arrest and death. They have survived by being useful, by being loyal in the specific performative way that Stalin's system required, by eliminating rivals before those rivals could eliminate them, by reading the signals of Stalin's changing preferences with the accuracy that proximity to power demanded. Among them, in the hours and days immediately following Stalin's death, is the man who has been positioned more centrally than any other in the administrative machinery of the Soviet state. The man whose signature has appeared on more key documents, whose presence has been required at more crucial meetings, whose organizational reach has extended more comprehensively across the institutions of Soviet power than any of his colleagues. That man is Georgy Maximilianovich Malenkov. He is 51 years old. He has spent his entire adult life in the service of the Soviet state and the Communist Party. He has risen from a provincial party worker to the second most powerful position in the Soviet Union through a combination of organizational ability, political acuity, and the specific talent for surviving the proximity of a man who consumed most of the people around him. For a brief moment, in the days and weeks following Stalin's death, it appears that Malenkov has succeeded, that the decades of service, the careful navigation, the organizational mastery have placed him at the summit of Soviet power at exactly the right moment. He is wrong. Within 2 years, he will be removed from the premiership. Within 4 years, he will be expelled from the Politburo. Within 7 years, he will be managing a power plant in Kazakhstan, as far from the center of Soviet power as it is possible to be sent without being sent to a labor camp. The story of Georgy Malenkov is the story of what it meant to be the most trusted man in Stalin's system, and of what that trust was actually worth when the system's organizing principle, the absolute dominance of a single will, was suddenly removed. Georgy Malenkov was born on January 8, 1902, in Orenburg, a provincial city in the southern Urals, into a family of mixed social background. His father, a railway official, his mother, from a family of craftsmen. His origins were neither the aristocratic background of some pre-revolutionary intellectuals who joined the Bolshevik movement, nor the genuine proletarian background that the party's mythology celebrated. He came from the educated middle strata of provincial Russian society that provided many of the Soviet administrative class's most capable members. He joined the Communist Party in 1920 at the age of 18, during his service in the Red Army during the Civil War. His entry into the party apparatus in the early 1920s, when the organizational structures of the Soviet state were still being constructed and the bureaucratic machinery of one-party rule was developing its institutional forms, placed him in the formative period of the system he would spend his life serving. His entry into the Central Party apparatus in Moscow came through the organizational department of the Central Committee, and it was in organizational work that his specific capabilities were first identified and developed. The organizational apparatus of the party, responsible for personnel assignments and the management of the party's internal structure, was one of the most powerful institutional positions in the Soviet system, because control over personnel meant control over who held power at every level of the party and state hierarchy. His connection to Stalin developed through this organizational work, as Stalin built his control over the party apparatus through the secretariat and the organizational departments that controlled personnel appointments. Malenkov's abilities as an organizational operator, his capacity for managing complex bureaucratic processes, and for the specific work of personnel management that the party apparatus required, made him valuable to Stalin's project of administrative control. By the mid-1930s, Malenkov was established as one of Stalin's most important organizational operatives, a key figure in the Central Party apparatus with access to and involvement in the most sensitive operations of the Soviet political system. His role in the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 was direct and significant, and the documentary record of this period establishes his participation in the mechanisms of the terror with a specificity that his subsequent political rehabilitation attempts could not fully erase. Malenkov's role in the Great Terror operated through several channels. He was involved in the work of the Central Committee apparatus in managing the personnel operations of the terror, the identification of targets, and the processing of cases through the party's own institutional mechanisms. He traveled to various regions of the Soviet Union during 1937 and 1938 as a representative of the Central Party leadership, participating in the local operations of the purge, and in some cases directly overseeing the acceleration of arrests and executions in regions where the local officials were not producing results at the pace Moscow required. The documentary evidence of his participation in specific regional terror operations includes his presence in Belarusia in 1937, where his arrival was followed by intensification of the purge operations, and in Armenia, where similar patterns were documented. He was functioning as Stalin's personal representative in these operations, carrying the authority of the center and applying it to the acceleration of local terror campaigns. His relationship with Nikolai Yezhov, the NKVD chief who presided over the Great Terror at its most intensive in 1937 and 1938, was close during this period. A working relationship between the party apparatus's organizational operations and the security apparatus's investigative and execution machinery. When Yezhov was himself arrested in 1939 as the terror consumed its own chief organizer, Malenkov's ability to distance himself from the Yezhov connection and to survive the transition to Beria's leadership of the NKVD demonstrated the political agility that characterized his career. His rise through the war years consolidated his position as one of the most significant figures in the Soviet leadership. He was a member of the State Defense Committee, the wartime executive body that coordinated the Soviet war effort, which placed him at the center of the most important decisions of the conflict. His organizational abilities were deployed across the massive administrative challenges of wartime mobilization, the management of industrial evacuation, the coordination of the defense production that ultimately provided the material basis for Soviet military success. His involvement in the wartime management of the aviation industry is documented and was politically significant. He was associated with the oversight of aviation production at a time when serious quality and production problems existed in Soviet aircraft manufacturing, and the subsequent investigation of these problems involved questions about responsibility that touched on his oversight role. The Aviators' Affair of 1946, in which senior aviation industry and Air Force officials were arrested and prosecuted for production failures, was an episode that Malenkov navigated carefully, managing his relationship to the accusations without becoming their target. By the late 1940s, Malenkov had survived long enough in proximity to Stalin to become one of the small number of figures who could be considered genuinely central to the Soviet leadership. His position in the Secretariat of the Central Committee, combined with his Politburo membership and his organizational reach across the party apparatus, made him arguably the most powerful figure in the Soviet system, after Stalin himself. The Leningrad Affair of 1949 and 1950 is the episode that most clearly demonstrates both the extent of Malenkov's power and the specific way in which that power was exercised. The Leningrad Affair was the prosecution and execution of a significant group of senior party and state officials associated with the Leningrad Party organization, including Nikolai Voznesensky, the chairman of the State Planning Commission and a Politburo member, and Alexei Kuznetsov, the Central Committee secretary responsible for party personnel and security matters. The political background of the Leningrad Affair involved the factional dynamics of the post-war Soviet leadership, in which Malenkov and Beria represented one grouping, and the Leningrad-associated figures represented a potential alternative center of power that might challenge their dominance. The accusations against the Leningrad officials involved allegations of separatism, of organizing a Russian Communist Party that would challenge the all-Union party structure, and of economic irregularities, all of which were the standard framing of political prosecutions in the Stalin era. Malenkov's role in the Leningrad Affair was central and documented. He was the primary driver of the investigation and prosecution from the party apparatus side, working with Beria to build the case against the Leningrad officials and to ensure that Stalin directed his suspicion and his institutional power against figures who represented a potential challenge to Malenkov's own position. The execution of Voznesensky and Kuznetsov, along with numerous other officials connected to the Leningrad organization, consolidated Malenkov's position as the dominant figure in the Soviet administrative apparatus and eliminated the most significant alternative power center. The Leningrad Affair illustrates the specific mechanism by which advancement at the top of the Stalinist system worked. It was not enough to be competent and loyal. Advancement required the elimination of rivals, and elimination in the Stalinist system meant not demotion or political defeat, but arrest, prosecution, and in the most significant cases, execution. Malenkov was not simply a bureaucrat who rose through competent service. He was a political operator who survived and advanced by ensuring that the alternatives to his advancement did not survive. The final years of Stalin's life, roughly 1950 through 1953, were a period of intensifying political uncertainty within the Soviet leadership, as Stalin's aging and declining health raised the question of succession without anyone being able to raise that question explicitly. Stalin himself contributed to the uncertainty by continuing to play his senior officials against each other, by initiating new purge operations that threatened even the most established figures, and by maintaining the systemic unpredictability that had always been a feature of his governance. The Doctors' Plot of 1952 and early 1953, the accusation that a group of predominantly Jewish Kremlin doctors had conspired to murder Soviet leaders, was the most significant of the late Stalinist political operations in terms of its implications for the leadership. The investigation of the Doctors' Plot was connected to the broader anti-cosmopolitan campaign that had been targeting Jewish figures across the Soviet cultural and intellectual establishment, and its potential implications for the political leadership itself, specifically for Beria, whose NKVD had supposedly failed to detect the conspiracy, were understood by everyone in the senior leadership. Malenkov's position in the doctor's plot period was one of careful navigation. He was present in the leadership discussions that shaped the operation's political direction. He was close enough to the center of power to understand what was happening and what it might mean for the various figures in the leadership. He managed his institutional position without becoming the target of the operation's expanding logic, a feat of political survival that required the specific skills he had developed across decades of proximity to Stalin. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, after several days of incapacitation following his stroke, transformed the political situation with the suddenness that only the death of an absolute ruler can produce. The system that had been organized entirely around Stalin's personal authority, in which every significant decision had been referred to him, and every significant relationship had been mediated through him, was suddenly without its organizing center. The men who gathered in the hours and days following Stalin's death to determine how power would be organized in the new situation were men who had no experience of collective leadership because Stalin's system had not permitted collective leadership to exist. They were men who had survived by being individually useful to a single dominant will, and they were now required to create a new political structure without a template, and without any of them having the authority to simply declare himself the successor. The initial settlement reached in the days immediately following Stalin's death distributed power among the senior figures in a collective leadership arrangement that was described as a return to Leninist norms of party governance. Malenkov received the position of chairman of the Council of Ministers, the head of the Soviet government, the administrative position most analogous to a prime minister in Western political systems. He also initially retained his position in the party secretariat, giving him simultaneous control of both the governmental and the party administrative machinery. This initial concentration of both governmental and party positions in Malenkov's hands lasted only days before his colleagues insisted on its modification. Within 2 weeks of Stalin's death, Malenkov resigned from the party secretariat, retaining only the governmental position. The circumstances of this rapid adjustment reflect the specific political dynamic of the succession struggle's opening phase. Malenkov's colleagues, particularly Khrushchev, understood that the simultaneous holding of the government and party leadership positions reproduced the concentration of power that had made Stalin's dominance possible, and they moved quickly to prevent any single figure from establishing that kind of control. Nikita Khrushchev's assumption of the position of first secretary of the party, which occurred in September 1953, was the most significant institutional development of the succession period, and the one that ultimately determined the outcome of the power struggle. By securing the party secretaryship, Khrushchev obtained control of the party apparatus, the personnel management system, the organizational machinery that controlled appointments and removals across the entire Soviet system. This was the institutional position that Stalin himself had used to build his dominance in the 1920s, and Khrushchev's understanding of its significance reflected his own organizational experience and political acuity. Malenkov, holding the governmental position, found himself in a structural relationship to the party apparatus that was disadvantageous in ways that would become increasingly apparent as the succession struggle developed. The political differentiation between Malenkov and Khrushchev in the period of collective leadership was not simply a struggle over institutional positions. It involved genuine policy differences that reflected different assessments of what the Soviet Union needed in the post-Stalin period. Malenkov, in his governmental role, articulated positions that historians have characterized as relatively reformist within the framework of Soviet politics. A greater emphasis on consumer goods production rather than heavy industry, a reduction in international tensions that he described using language of peaceful coexistence, and an implicit acknowledgement that the costs of the Stalinist development model had been excessive. His statement, documented in public speeches in 1954, that a nuclear war between the great powers could mean the destruction of civilization, was a significant departure from the standard Soviet military political rhetoric of the period, and reflected a genuine assessment of what the hydrogen bomb's development meant for international relations. This statement, and the broader policy positions it reflected, became one of the points of political attack used against him by his opponents, who characterized these positions as defeatist and as incompatible with the requirements of Soviet security. Khrushchev's political strategy in the period from 1953 to 1955 involved the systematic construction of a coalition against Malenkov within the senior leadership. The gradual accumulation of support from figures who preferred Khrushchev's alignment to Malenkov's, and the development of specific policy criticisms that could be used in the institutional forums of the Politburo and the Central Committee to challenge Malenkov's governmental performance. The agricultural policy debate was one of the principal arenas of this political conflict. The Soviet agricultural sector was in a condition of chronic underperformance that the Stalin-era's collectivization policies had produced and that the post-Stalin leadership had to address. Khrushchev invested heavily in agricultural policy as both a genuine priority and a political terrain, developing the Virgin Lands campaign that opened new agricultural areas in Kazakhstan and Siberia to cultivation as his signature policy initiative, and positioning himself as the more energetic and committed reformer in agricultural development. Malenkov's governmental performance in the agricultural area was subjected to criticism in the party forums where Khrushchev was building his institutional position, and this criticism, combined with the broader policy disagreements and the structural advantage that control of the party apparatus provided to Khrushchev, eroded Malenkov's position through 1954 and into early 1955. The decisive moment came in January and February of 1955, when the Presidium and the Central Committee considered Malenkov's governmental performance and the political criticisms that had been accumulated against him. The specific charges made against him in these proceedings reflected both genuine policy disagreements and the politically motivated framing of those disagreements in terms of ideological deviation and incompetence. His association with the Leningrad affair, the prosecution and execution of the Leningrad officials in 1949 and 1950, was raised against him, an ironic reversal in which the political operation he had been central to conducting was now being used as evidence of his own criminal conduct. His alleged role in the aviation production failures of the wartime period was revisited. His statements on nuclear war and peaceful coexistence were characterized as ideologically unsound. On February 8, 1955, Malenkov submitted his resignation as chairman of the Council of Ministers to the Supreme Soviet. The resignation letter, which was read publicly, acknowledged failures in agricultural policy and in economic management, accepted personal responsibility for shortcomings in governmental performance, and requested to be relieved of his duties. The specific language of the resignation was the standard Soviet formulation for a forced political removal dressed in the language of voluntary acknowledgement of failure. He was replaced as chairman of the Council of Ministers by Nikolai Bulganin, a figure closely associated with Khrushchev. Malenkov himself was retained in the leadership, assigned to the position of Minister of Electric Power Stations, a demotion from the summit of Soviet power to a technical ministerial role that reflected the post-Stalin system's difference from the Stalin system in one fundamental respect. He was not arrested. He was not shot. He was demoted and marginalized, but he remained alive and nominally within the institutional framework of Soviet power. This difference from the Stalin-era pattern of political removal was itself significant. The post-Stalin succession struggle was conducted with political weapons rather than lethal ones, at least at the senior level. The men who had spent their careers navigating a system where political defeat meant death were now operating in a system where political defeat meant demotion and marginalization. The adjustment required was not simply institutional, but psychological, a shift in the fundamental parameters of political calculation. Malenkov's subsequent involvement in the anti-party group affair of 1957 was his final significant political act, and the one that definitively ended his career as a major figure in Soviet politics. The anti-party group was the coalition of senior presidium members, including Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich, who in June 1957 attempted to remove Khrushchev from the position of first secretary, using the presidium vote that had theoretically been available for this purpose since Stalin's death. The specific political context of the 1957 attempt reflected the accumulation of tensions within the senior leadership over Khrushchev's increasingly dominant position, his de-Stalinization policies, including the secret speech of 1956, his agricultural initiatives, and his management of foreign policy through the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and other international crises. Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich represented the more conservative faction of the senior leadership that had found Khrushchev's direction increasingly problematic, and that saw the presidium vote as the legitimate institutional mechanism for changing course. The vote in the presidium went against Khrushchev, with a majority of presidium members initially supporting the motion to remove him. What the anti-party group had failed to account for was the Central Committee, the larger party body whose members Khrushchev had cultivated through his control of the party apparatus and whose support he could mobilize against the presidium majority. Khrushchev insisted that the Central Committee had to confirm any decision about his removal, and the marshalling of Central Committee members to Moscow, facilitated in part by military transport arranged with the support of Defense Minister Georgy, produced a plenary session that reversed the presidium decision and condemned the anti-party group. The condemnation of the anti-party group in June 1957 was Malenkov's final political defeat. He was expelled from the Presidium and the Central Committee, removed from his ministerial position, and subjected to the public denunciation that the Soviet system applied to political losers. The specific charges made against him in the anti-party group proceedings included his role in the Leningrad affair and his earlier participation in the terror's operations, accusations that were politically motivated in their timing, but factually grounded in the documented record of his career. His assignment following expulsion from the central leadership was to the directorship of a hydroelectric power station in Ust-Kamenogorsk in Kazakhstan, a posting that placed him literally at the geographic periphery of the Soviet system, managing a technical facility in a remote region as far from Moscow's political center as the assignment could reasonably achieve. The specific choice of a power industry posting reflected his ministerial experience in that sector, but its practical meaning was exile from everything he had spent his life building. He remained in Kazakhstan for several years, managing the power station with the organizational competence that had characterized his career, now applied to the management of turbines and electrical output, rather than to the management of a nuclear superpower's political apparatus. The specific texture of his daily existence in this period, the experience of a man who had stood at the summit of Soviet power, managing a provincial power plant, is not extensively documented in the available sources. He was expelled from the Communist Party itself in 1961, following the 22nd Party Congress at which Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign reached its most public expression, with Stalin's body removed from the Lenin mausoleum and the crimes of the Stalin era officially condemned. The expulsion from the party completed his institutional removal from every position within the Soviet system that had defined his existence. His subsequent years, spent in Moscow after his return from Kazakhstan, were years of political irrelevance and personal obscurity. He was a pensioner, one of the most significant figures of the Stalin era living in retirement while the Soviet system he had served continued to evolve through Khrushchev's removal in 1964, the Brezhnev era, and eventually the Gorbachev reforms and the Soviet collapse. He lived long enough to see the Soviet Union he had helped construct enter its final crisis. He died on January 14, 1988, at the age of 85, in Moscow, in the early months of Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika policies that would ultimately contribute to the system's dissolution. He had outlived Stalin by 35 years, outlived Khrushchev by 18 years, outlived most of the people who had been his colleagues at the summit of Soviet power. The historical assessment of Georgy Malenkov is complicated by the specific nature of his career and the specific political context of his removal. He was not, in any simple sense, a reformer or a liberal within the Soviet system. His career was built on organizational service to Stalin's most violent operations, on participation in the terror, on the elimination of rivals through the machinery of political prosecution. The positions he articulated as prime minister, the emphasis on consumer goods, the language of peaceful coexistence, may have reflected genuine policy convictions, or may have been tactical political positioning designed to distinguish himself from the more Stalinist positions of his rivals. The historical counterfactual of a Malenkov-led Soviet Union in the post-Stalin period, one in which his positions had prevailed over Khrushchev's, is one that historians have explored without reaching confident conclusions. His emphasis on consumer goods over heavy industry, if sustained, would have required significant restructuring of the Soviet economic model. His apparent willingness to reduce international tensions might have produced a different trajectory in the Cold War. Whether these tendencies represented a genuine alternative political direction or would have been constrained by the same systemic factors that constrained every Soviet leader is a question that his removal makes impossible to definitively answer. What his career most clearly demonstrates is the specific nature of power at the top of the Stalinist system, and the specific problem of succession in a system organized around absolute personal authority. Stalin's power was not transferable because it was not institutional in any normal sense. It was personal, charismatic in the specific Weberian sense of authority, grounded in the exceptional qualities attributed to an individual, maintained through the combination of genuine terror and the ideological framework that elevated Stalin to something approaching infallibility. The institutional positions Stalin held, General Secretary, Chairman of the Council of Ministers, were vehicles for his power rather than its source. Malenkov's mistake, if it can be called that, was to believe that holding Stalin's institutional positions would provide the kind of authority that Stalin had wielded through those positions. The chairmanship of the Council of Ministers did not carry the authority that Stalin had brought to it. The party secretariat that Khrushchev obtained did not initially carry the authority Stalin had built through it. The institutional shells were available, but the animating power, the personal authority that had made Stalin's system function, was not transferable. The collective leadership arrangement that emerged from Stalin's death was not simply a temporary expedient on the way to a new single leader's emergence. It reflected the genuine impossibility of direct succession in a system that had eliminated the mechanisms by which succession could be organized. No single figure had the authority to declare himself Stalin's successor without the other's consent, and no figure was willing to grant another figure that consent. The succession struggle that produced Khrushchev's dominance by 1957 and Malenkov's expulsion was therefore not simply a contest between individuals with different policy positions and different political resources. It was the working out of the fundamental problem of what happens to a political system built entirely around the authority of a single individual when that individual is gone. Malenkov had been the most powerful figure in that system after Stalin. He had the organizational reach, the institutional positions, the documented trust of the man who had organized everything around himself. He had survived 3 decades of proximity to the most dangerous political environment in the world, and when Stalin died, none of it was enough. The trust that Stalin had placed in him was Stalin's trust, specific to the relationship between the two men and to the system Stalin had built. When Stalin was gone, the trust was gone with him. What remained was a man with extensive organizational skills and deep institutional knowledge operating in a political environment whose rules had changed in ways that his specific capabilities did not fully address. Khrushchev, with his different skills and his different political approach, his peasant directness and his organizational energy, and his willingness to break with the Stalin past in ways that Malenkov could not fully embrace given his deeper involvement in that past, was better suited to the specific requirements of the post-Stalin succession struggle. Power at the top of the Soviet system had always been unstable. Stalin had maintained it through terror, through the systematic elimination of any alternative to his own dominance. In the post-Stalin system, the terror was attenuated, but the instability remained, now expressed through institutional maneuvering and political coalition building, rather than through arrest and execution. Malenkov understood the old system's rules with complete mastery. He never fully mastered the new system's different requirements. That is why he ended his career managing a power station in Kazakhstan. That is why the man whom Stalin trusted with everything ultimately received, in the accounting of history, considerably less than everything in return. The summit of Soviet power was always, for everyone who reached it, a temporary position. Stalin had made it seem permanent through the specific instruments of his dominance. His death revealed that the permanence had been an illusion, that the summit was as unstable as everything below it, that the system's organizing logic of suspicion and elimination and control extended even to the men who stood closest to its center. Malenkov stood closest of all for the longest time, and it was not enough. It was never going to be enough.